Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to give you a brief welcome before we get started. I'm Maya Elenevsky, the Events and Outreach Manager here at the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society with the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. The ACMHE is a multidisciplinary academic association with a membership of over 700 educators, staff, students, and researchers committed to the transformation of higher education through contemplative methods. The ACMHE is an initiative of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. I'd like to welcome you to our June 2019 Contemplative Education webinar, I Got Soul, Soulfulness, Culture, and Contemplative Practice with Dr. Shelly Harrell. Now I'd like to give you a little background about our presenter. Dr. Shelly Harrell is a psychologist whose work focuses on individual, relational, and collective well-being in the context of culture and oppression. She has been a professor at Pepperdine University's Graduate School of Education and Psychology for 20 years, where she primarily teaches and trains students in their clinical psychology doctoral program. Her current research involves the development of a resilience-oriented group intervention integrating contemplative, communal, and empowerment change processes. Her applied work includes workshops and consulting on culturally attuned psychotherapeutic interventions, cultural adaptation of evidence-based practices, stress and resilience, dynamics of difference, intergroup relations, and cultural diversity in the training of mental health professionals. She introduced Soulfulness in the Journal of Contemplative Inquiry in 2018. Her Soulfulness approach to contemplative practice has been presented at several conferences, including the 2018 ACMHE conference. Dr. Harrell has numerous publications and professional presentations on topics including racism-related stress, intergroup relations, diversity principles for practice, therapeutic journaling, race and culture in clinical supervision, and conceptualizing the role of culture in well-being. She conducts meditation workshops and classes in the predominantly African American and culturally diverse communities of Los Angeles. She also has a small psychotherapy practice. We are extremely excited to have her here with us today. Please welcome Shelly.
Thank you, Maya, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I am looking forward to introducing you to Soulfulness. So I am going to check out visually, and you'll hear me throughout the presentation, and then I will check back in for the Q&A. So I just want to invite you into Soulfulness. During this webinar, we'll introduce Soulfulness to you experientially. So there's a few practices that I want to share with you. I'm excited to share with you, conceptually, and again practically. So we're going to start with an invitation to the river, and I'm going to read these quotes. The river begins at source and returns to source unerringly. This happens every single time without exception. We are no different. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in the human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I feel myself a soul as immense as the world, truly a soul as deep as the deepest rivers. I'm going to lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. I'm going to lay down my heavy load down by the riverside. I'm going to study war no more. I've got peace like a river in my soul. I've got a river in my soul. Take a deep breath. Coming to the river is coming into soulfulness. I like metaphors, and I think the river is a really powerful metaphor. It really kind of speaks to the depths of connection Rivers connect to source and connect us to something larger than ourselves. And in the cultural context of African Americans, rivers have a particular important role. They served during enslavement as a gathering place for community away from enslavement. In a religious context, rivers are places of rebirth, baptism, purification, transformation. And we can find peace by the riverside. Crossing rivers are very symbolic, and during enslavement symbolize crossing from bondage into freedom. So coming to the river is coming into soulfulness, and there's a lot of shared characteristics. River is also movement, sometimes gentle, sometimes strong, right? So kind of hold on to that feeling, that experiential feeling of a river as I introduce you to soulfulness. So the main goals of the webinar is, again, to introduce soulfulness as an approach to contemplative practice. I want to describe the primary influences. How did I get here? How did I come up with this way of approaching contemplative practice, and what were the main influences? I want to share a framework for using soulfulness as a center for developing practices, for developing contemplative practices. I want to present the 8 qualities of soulfulness, and I'm going to be integrating examples throughout. So I'm really introducing and offering soulfulness to you as a way of orienting to meditation and other contemplative practices that centers contact with soul. So there's a variety of methods, and they're really about reconnecting with one's transcendent essence, which is a way of thinking about soul, the truth of lived experience. Right? We're thinking about how we can connect people meaningfully to the callings and whisperings of soul wisdom, right? To help people notice when there's stirring in the soul, when the soul has been touched and moved. So when we talk about soulfulness in an applied way, we're thinking about inspiring and facilitating soul level experiencing, right? And I do a lot of stress management work. And one of the things I'll often say is we want to move from being stressed out to energized within, right? And so that's kind of what we're talking about with soulfulness, is practices aimed at enhancing inner attunement, and deepening resonance with self and deepening resonance with others. So soulfulness really honors a feeling level knowing that emerges from the power and truth of our interconnectedness. And it's you know, I'll talk a bit about music, but music is very central to soulfulness, and music is a vehicle for feeling that resonance. So let's kind of take a couple steps back, and I want to identify a couple of the influences on the path to kind of constructing this approach. So you can see the pictures here, the cultural positioning of secular mindfulness. And I take mindfulness because it is, a kind of prototypical contemplative practice. And many people are familiar. It's more accessible over time, and has become rather commercialized. And Purser and Loy, coined the term mech mindfulness, to really describe how mindfulness, the secularization and the commercialization of mindfulness, really promotes individualism. It's like convenient, expedient, personal success and happiness. Mindfulness will bring you all of these things. Another thing that is really clear is there's a dominance of white males positioned as experts on mindfulness and meditation, which is, I think, something to reflect on and kind of interrogate a little bit in terms of, who can speak, with authority about contacting one's lived experience and contacting and being present. All the aspects of mindfulness are not unique to a particular culture. There's in psychology, Maya introduced me and indicated that I'm a psychologist. Mindfulness has really gotten infused into a lot of psychotherapies, and these are primarily in the family of third wave behavioral therapies, but in many other therapies as well. And they tend to be pretty scripted and mechanistic. And clearly mindfulness is being introduced into schools, and sometimes there's a feeling that we can tame those unruly children with mindfulness. In my own work in diverse communities, I've had my own meditation practice for many, many years. I've practiced mindfulness for many years as well. I'm currently in training to be a certified mindfulness meditation teacher, and I've drank some of the Kool-Aid. I believed in the effectiveness of these processes, but what I've noticed is that mindfulness as it is packaged and delivered does not always take with communities where sometimes it's experienced as weird or strange, or it just doesn't feel familiar. And sometimes the association with Buddhism in Christian communities is experienced as conflicting. And these are all complex issues to think about. But soulfulness is really coming from a place of thinking about delivering this really effective, right, really powerful practice to communities in ways that feel resonant with the culture and the vibes, right, of that community. So I feel like we need diverse voices and experiences to work with mindfulness and broader contemplative practices to make sure that there's a cultural responsiveness in the work that we do. So as I sat in many, meditation workshops and short retreats, and it always felt to me that something was missing. And as I've talked with colleagues and community members and clients, it sometimes can feel very desouled, right? And that is a problem. Sometimes when we popularize something or commercialize something, the soul is taken out of it. And this occurs in psychology in many ways. I am very happy that heartfulness, compassion work are getting more substantially integrated. And however, there's still not a whole lot of focused attention on the sense of soul in the current mindfulness literature. Now, we need to keep in mind, authentic mindfulness practices and deep mindfulness practices recognize that the mind is inseparable from the heart and soul, and that in some ways those are interchangeable in a sense. But mindfulness is often delivered with an emphasis on kind of detachment, equanimity, control. And it may not resonate so strongly with cultures that value expression or have a collective orientation. So I think that when we think about soul, we're really referring to the deepest part of ourselves, our truth, our wisdom, where we feel moved deeply. Soul is relational. You feel soulfulness. You feel soul. So it's you know, for people who really value that way of being in the world, sometimes certain deliveries of mindfulness can feel a little too detached, a little too intellectualized, and that is part of why they may not always resonate in interventions in some diverse communities. Culture is part of the soul. Culture is a really important consideration in understanding human behavior and who we are in the world. And many psychological interventions are looking more seriously at how do we make ourselves relevant? How do we take these interventions and make them more relevant to communities so that we can be more helpful, so that the practice can feel more resonant. So this concept of soul resonates powerfully with many people of color, people of the global majority, right? It's embedded in the worldview of African, Native American, and many indigenous people around the world. And of course, it has strong roots in African American experiences, in diasporic African cultural expressions, where it's associated with an expressive aliveness and connectedness born of lived experience. You think about soul music, soul food, terminology, soul brother, soul sister, soul power is about connectedness and aliveness. So what I'm kind of offering is that soul may be a doorway into contemplative practice that might be more accessible and experienced as more natural and culturally congruent with some cultural communities. So when we think about these ideas of mindfulness, heartfulness, soulfulness, that they again are all connected, and you know, we could actually argue that they're somewhat interchangeable. And I would argue that we need to enter in the zone that's most culturally resonant with the people we are working with. So, you know, the emphasis of mindfulness, you know, typically is presence, equanimity, non-judgment. This work around heartfulness, we're emphasizing loving kindness and compassion and tenderness. And soulfulness is emphasizing deepness, aliveness, and connectedness. So obviously all of these things are important, but again, what door do we want to invite people into first as we introduce these variety of contemplative practices that can be very powerful and helpful? So I'm going to kind of offer a definition of contemplative practice that I use to kind of ground myself. So I want to offer this definition as diverse strategies for deepening and expanding experiential awareness and critical consciousness by bearing witness to lived experience internally, relationally, and collectively. So we think about contemplative practice, we're expanding awareness and this notion of critical consciousness, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. So the contemplative practices involve experiencing, deepening, enhancing mental, somatic, emotional, relational, and spiritual energies. And these practices, I believe, are in the service of optimizing the conditions for healing, transformation, liberation, and the highest expression of our potentialities, personally, relationally, and collectively, right? And you notice I intentionally include personal, relational, collective, internally, relationally, collectively, because it's important to be inclusive of worldviews that are collective and communal in nature, and that our interventions speak to those values and groundings, so that perhaps we can touch people and welcome people into this world of contemplative practice in a way that feels resonant, and sometimes focusing on kind of personal achievement and happiness and, you know, sort of control doesn't always feel congruent. It's also important to contextualize contemplative practices, right? So any human behavior occurs within larger sociocultural and sociopolitical contexts. And so we need to think about culture, context, and liberation as being woven into the practices, whether we're aware of it or not. Right? Any practice emerged from somewhere in some cultural context. So I offer just a way of thinking about culture, and I don't want to stay on these slides a long time. And what you'll notice is that, you know, I've offered a lot of content on the slides. I'm giving you a kind of broad sweep in terms of an introduction to soulfulness, and I'm not going to read every slide, but for those of you that may want to download the slides at some point, you'll have a little more depth than I'm able to go into in the time provided. But think about culture as a shared way of life among a group of people. And it's characterized by systems of knowledge, meaning, interactions. And I like alliteration, so I think about these patterns of being, believing, bonding, belonging, becoming, behaving, right? And it's these ways of life in the world have broad implications for how people live. I'm sorry about that. So we want to think about culture as being embedded in social and institutional context, internalized as patterns of meaning and identity, expressed through actions and relationships in the context of power dynamics, and interactive with coexisting and intersecting cultural systems. So we all have multiple dimensions of human diversity that express as shared ways of living in the world, and these reflect shared identity and experience, and those are interactive, so that intersectionality becomes really important in thinking about culture as well. So the idea of centering culture in how we understand contemplative practices is part of what I want to offer to you, and being very explicit, right, that I'm centering culture. So when we're not explicit about that, some ways of being, believing, bonding, behaving, becoming, some of those dimensions, elements of culture are clearly more valued than others. The culture of the dominant group is often seen as normal. Right? Privilege is expressed in what we don't have to pay attention to, things that don't occur to us. Right? So we need to be aware of how we've internalized these kind of unquestioned narratives about what's acceptable, what's desirable, what's healthy, what's normal, and this is the way things are done. And these dynamics apply to contemplative practice too. So an example is the way mindfulness is taught reflects cultural sensibilities of the United States, right, and countries that share similar cultural characteristics. And so it's going to resonate most strongly in those places. So we're talking about the more secularized, commercialized, app-oriented way that mindfulness is frequently delivered. So in thinking about culture and contemplative practice, I'm doing a recentering of sorts. And, you know, I invite you all to play the song Superbad by James Brown, right? Most of you may be familiar with it. And I like to offer a contemplative translation. I think we learn about contemplative practice and processes from a lot of different sources. There isn't one way to be contemplative. And so I offer a translation of this song. So some of the lyrics from the song, I got something that makes me want to shout, right? And the contemplative translation is, I am connected to an inner aliveness that is compelled into expression. Right? I got something that tells me what it's all about. I am connected to an inner wisdom where I can find personal and collective truths. I got soul. I am connected to the deepest essence of my being, an energy that stirs and moves me. And I'm super bad. I feel my innate dignity and worth, that I am an amazing person of value with gifts to share in the world, right? So those of you that know the song, it's not, you know, some kind of ambient, new age kind of feel to it. It's got a lot of power to it, but it's delivering a message that is contemplative in nature. So I'm challenging us to rethink what we may think as normal in contemplative practice. Right? So I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan in early 1960s, and soul music was my first teacher of contemplative practice. And you know, when I present on soulfulness over a longer period of time, I'll play a lot of music that speaks to that. So soul music is a really significant pathway to soul level experiencing. And music in general is an important pathway to soul level experiencing, right? I know that we all probably have songs that touch our soul, right? That express what's happening at our deepest level of experiencing, right? So music expresses and transmits culture. It connects us to human experience across time and place. There's a sense of resonance, affirmation, identification, shared experience. We are not alone. Music facilitates experiencing, emotional experiencing, body experiencing, immersion, flow, being in the zone with the beat and the rhythm and the music, being in touch with our bodies. Music communicates collective wisdom, right? And it's an opportunity to process and work through. You know, I know, you know, this is probably more common in adolescence, but we adults do this as well. Sometimes we'll listen to a song over and over and over and over again, right? Right? And it's a way of processing and working through in the service of healing and transformation. So music is very central in soulfulness practice, as it is a strategy that can touch the soul very deeply. So the main influences in the development of soulfulness, I read everything about soul, you know, as I was percolating on this, the psychological literature, spiritually based literature, cultural literature. Clearly, contemplative studies, contemplative science, contemplative pedagogy plays a role, has played a significant role in conceptualizing soulfulness. African American soul, diasporic African cultural expressions, which I'm going to go into a little bit more. And then, you know, within my own work, I emphasize liberation psychology, cultural psychologies, community psychology, and how I think about sort of the etiology of people's behaviors and conditions, and how to think about transforming them, and then diverse spiritual and wisdom traditions. So African-centered psychology is one of the cultural psychologies, and that really centers understanding the world from a diasporic African place. And within African-centered psychology, there's really a centrality of spirituality, an ethos of interconnectedness, a collective consciousness, a communal orientation. And these are part of the grounding of soulfulness, right? So we think about how would we apply soulfulness to contemplative practice? A big piece is grounding in these elements of soulfulness that, as I've been developing this over time, are strongly influenced by an African-centered psychology. Now, does that mean that it's only relevant to people of African descent? No, right? We resonate, all of us resonate across cultures, and there's elements of cultures that are shared across cultures, right? And sometimes we resonate with a unique element of particular culture. What I'm doing is just claiming where I'm grounded, right? And again, every intervention is grounded somewhere, but sometimes they're presented as if, well, this is just how it's done. And I'm saying, no, we need to be very clear about where we're coming from. There are a couple of concepts that I think are really important. The concept of Ubuntu, I am because we are, I am, recognition of our kind of spiritually infused interconnectedness, our interconnected humanity. We thrive and exist in community. And then the Sawubona, which is a greeting in South Africa that means I see you. I see the truth and essence of who you are beyond your conditions, right? And I see you beneath and beyond the visible. So the key concepts from African-centered psychology that have informed soulfulness are listed on this slide: spirituality, interconnectedness, communalism, harmony and balance, inner knowing, intuition, emotional experiencing and feeling. So we're not trying to cut off emotion. We really want to connect to emotion. I just got a note that we're still on the culture slide. Now I am scrolling through, so let me see here. I am going to stop showing the screen for a moment and then show the screen again and see if it resets.
It did.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you.
All right. Again, so this is the slide where presenting the core concepts of soulfulness that are informed from African-centered psychology. So I've also looked at various wisdom traditions that are African centered, and have integrated particularly Adinkra wisdom symbology. And Adinkra are visual symbols created by the Akan people in South Africa to represent concepts. They represent aphorisms. They embody sort of aspects of worldview and cosmology from an African perspective, how to understand the world and our place in the universe. And each symbol has a distinct meaning. And I love metaphor. I also love symbols. They help to anchor us. And they carry meaning and can touch the soul deeply. If we're thinking about what strategies can we use that kind of bring the soul alive a little bit, that touch the soul and get that movement stirring, going, so that we can direct people to be in contact and listen at the soul level. And I find that symbols as well as music do that. So there are many, many Adinkra symbols, and I just have a few of them up here, and just take in the feeling of the symbols. I just sit for a moment and take in the feeling of the symbols. Which one are you drawn to? Which ones really pull you in? You know, I use these in a variety of exercises and practices within Soulfulness. I use it in a naming ceremony where people adopt a symbol and create a name, a soul calling name. I've used them in making meditation stones. In fact, I did a couples retreat and couples created meditation stones. Here are a few of the Adinkra symbols that I use more frequently. Some of you may be familiar with Sankofa is probably the most well-known of the Adinkra symbols. Means go back and fetch it. It's about reconnection, ancestral connection, learning from the past to build the future. And in the service of time, I'm not going to go through all of these, but some of the themes are really congruent with kind of the energy we want to create around contemplative practice, right? So the inevitability of change, really understanding the dynamics of life, the good and bad coexist, you know, tuning into our wisdom, wise decision making, being grounded in truth, transformation. So contemplative practices can facilitate accessing cultural wisdom, right? And I think that that's a touch point that can be very powerful, particularly among historically oppressed groups that continue to experience transgenerational and ongoing oppression. This connection to a ground, a sense of cultural connection can be very powerful. I like quotes, so there's quotes throughout the presentation, and here are a few that I think begin to kind of connect this idea of why contemplative practice can be very powerful in working with historically oppressed groups and groups that are experiencing ongoing oppression. So Stephen Biko said, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Martin Luther King said, as long as the mind is enslaved, the body will never be free. And many of you know Redemption song, Bob Marley, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. And this quote, which is variously attributed to Naim Akbar or Karenga, power is the ability to define someone else's reality and get them to accept it as if it were their own, right? So understanding the impact of oppression on our minds is really critical. And so part of soulfulness is moving towards contacting the soul, right? So that we can be grounded in a place that can serve us as a refuge for the ways that we may have bought into some of the negative stereotypes, ways that we've internalized oppression, and taking a pause and grounding ourselves in those kind of core cultural soul experiences can be protective, right? But we have to take a break and realize that we may have gotten wrapped up and that we're, you know, buying into biases that aren't in our best interest. So I'm looking at the time, and I'm gonna kind of go a little quickly through a few of these slides, and then we're going to do a practice right at the end. Okay, so this concepts of how the soul is impacted by oppression have been offered both by bell hooks. Duran, who comes from a Native American tradition, speaks very powerfully about the soul wound and its impacts. And contemplative practice is also in the service of healing those soul wounds. So what is soul, right? I have some quotes here from Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin. Aretha says, soul is certainly a feeling that's transmitted in one way or another. It's empathetic and it's deep. Soul is deep. So she never read any of that literature on soul, but she knew what soul was and really captured some of the core elements of soul. So here on this slide, the general psychological and spiritual literature, kind of from that emerged 5 elements of soul: the sense of deepness, aliveness, authenticity, a resource for healing. We go to our soul to heal, and spirituality, right? Where the human and transcendent merge or intersect. From an African-centered and liberation psychology perspective, soul also is about connectedness and resonance, creativity, source of power, truth, freedom. So I want to offer this definition of soulfulness, right? So emerging from the convergence of spiritual, psychological, and cultural perspectives on soul, soulfulness is conceptualized as a quality of experiencing life in a deeply connected and connecting way, an enlivened inner attunement. Think about that, feeling alive inside, that illuminates authentic lived experience and radiates into outer expression, music, dance, poetry. It's an interconnected soulful aliveness that's often experienced as resonating, liberating, life-enhancing, deep connectivity, inspired expression. Right? So I also want to refer you guys to the article that Maya described in the Journal of Contemplative Inquiry. And I'm going to skip a couple of these slides. And these are, the definition and conceptualization of soulfulness is gone into in a lot more detail in the article. It's the December 2018 issue of the Journal of Contemplative Inquiry. So, I'm an academic, and frameworks and conceptualization is really important, having a grounding that's informed theoretically. So all of what I've talked about so far has contributed to an approach that I've systematized into a framework. So I call it a soul-centered approach, soulfulness-oriented, unitive, and liberatory. So each of those elements capture a central part of a soulfulness approach. So if you were interested in beginning to adapt some of your interventions or integrate some of your practices with soulfulness, these elements would need to be centered. This is what would be the defining characteristics of a soulfulness approach: aliveness, deepness, connection, transformation of oppression towards liberation, etc. I spoke about the impact of liberation psychology. Again, I won't go into that in the time we have, but I love this picture here, so I just wanted to stop on that for a moment. Thich Nhat Hanh, really a champion of activism within a Buddhist framework, and Martin Luther King. Everyone knows that peace has to begin with oneself, but not too many people know how to do it. And I have the Adinkra symbol for peace, and if you cannot find peace within yourself, you'll never find it anywhere else, Marvin Gaye. Right? So when we think about soulfulness, we're also not just thinking about the individual experience, but how does that show up in our relationships and then impact how we live in the world, particularly around liberation and transformation and change, right? So Thich Nhat Hanh says, meditation is to see deeply into things, to see how we can change, to see how we can transform our situation. Meditation is not to escape from society, but to come back to ourselves and see what's going on. Once there is seeing, there must be acting. Right? And James Baldwin says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And this quote from Gloria Anzaldúa really captures this important link between contemplative practice and how we live, and how we can live in a way that speaks to the realities of oppression and the importance of movement towards liberation. So Antodua says, breaking out of your emotional prison and deepening your range of perception enables you to link inner reflection and outer and vision, those mental, emotional, instinctive, imaginal, spiritual, body and bodily awareness, to link reflection and vision with social, political action and lived experiences. So we have a lot of voices saying it's not just about kind of sitting and navel gazing. We need to connect to the truth of our lived experience and transform that in ways that we express and actualize in the world. So again, I'm gonna refer you to the article, right? There's a framework that involves many principles, right? And the key here is when I present soulfulness, I don't use the terms centeredness, congruence, consciousness, etc. I use phrases that try to speak to something that is relatable. And even with very central core mindfulness principles, I use phrases, right? So when we think about that notion of beginner's mind, right, that principle is the born again principle. We think about the acceptance of what is, right? We talk about being woke to what is, or it is what it is. The struggle is real is a phrase that honors the vulnerability and struggles of the human condition. And so, you know, the framing of things is important in interventions, that we touch people in ways that connect to their lived experience, right? So in that first column, the soulfulness principles, remember who you are, keeping it real, free your mind, and still I rise. And, you know, again, I realize that I do want to move us to questions. So I'm just going to refer you to the article to really read, or actually you can download the slides and look at some of these principles in a little more detail. Okay. So the reframe for mindfulness meditation, being present in the present, being woke to what is, right? And I do some meditation workshops and classes in the community in Los Angeles, and people resonate with that idea of mindfulness. And again, an emphasis on the connection between meditation and liberation, right? We have to talk about liberating minds as well as liberating societies. Right? So that concept is central, and that helps people buy in to meditation, right? Then it feels like, to many people that I work with, this is going to be very relevant to my life, and to not just my life, but to the life of my community and my people, right? That we need to be able to see what's going on, to be woke, so to speak, so that we can transform our conditions, right? And not get lost and believe the hype, right, etc. So again, there's more detail here than I have time to go into, and I am recognizing that we need to turn to questions. So I'm going to just highlight a couple of more things here. A couple of these quotes I think are really important. Take a day to heal from the lies you've told yourself and those that have been told to you, right? People who shut their eyes simply invite their own destruction, right? So it's contemplative practice, meditation, mindfulness, about opening our eyes, becoming conscious. Okay. So I'm going to ask everybody to just kind of get comfortable for a moment and I'm going to guide us in what I use in some of the workshops called a soul word meditation, where we take a word, and in this case, the word is soul, but in other cases, we have one for rise and um, all sorts of words. But take a moment and just close your eyes, take a few deep breaths, really center in. And I want to invite you to intentionally tune in to your soul. Really bring the energy of soul into the present moment, into your experience. And so S is sense. Sense the call of the stirrings of your soul and create space, temporal, emotional, mental, spiritual space to contact what's moving within you. O is open yourself to experiencing. Open up to experiencing your inner aliveness as you awaken and bear witness to the truths of your lived experience. U is unveil. Unveil deeper understandings as you discern and illuminate the meanings and messages for your life, welcoming them with courage and gratitude. And L is liberate your soul's wisdom, freeing its emanating energy into expression as you actualize its highest manifestation. Liberate your soul's truth and wisdom, free it into expression, infused with love and in coexistence with all of creation. So that little contemplation, that little reflection is often how I may start a workshop or a class, just to bring people in to the process of deeper connecting at the soul level. So I am actually going to just let you know that these last slides present a couple more practices and describe a couple more practices that are used in soulfulness work so far. It's all still in development, right? And I had some closing quotes and reflections that you can also review in the PowerPoint slides if you want to download them. So we're going to end here and be able to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Shelly, for sharing your work with us. That was really wonderful. I want to let folks know that we will be uploading the PowerPoint slides to the website along with the recording, so that folks can have a little more time with each slide and take a look at all of the wonderful resources that you've provided. And also, we will be sharing the journal article that you've referenced, Shelly. So we'll share that with everyone as well.
Okay.
So I just wanted to pause for a moment and allow anyone who has questions that haven't submitted them yet to do so now. And I do see a hand raised, but I would ask whoever has raised their hand to submit a question into the question box that I believe is in your control panel. One of the questions that came in earlier on, and as I talk, please feel free to continue submitting questions. One question that came in earlier was appreciating that, appreciating your speaking to the importance of broadening cultural perspectives, and asking if you could say something about the voice of women in heart, mind, soulfulness traditions.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that, you know, in psychology, one of the criticisms of psychological theory has been that it's been very male-centric and focused on, you know, kind of logic, rationality, sort of those valuing those ways of being in the world, and women's ways of being in the world also kind of, you know, very much intersect with this notion of feeling and valuing a feeling orientation and a relational orientation. So there's a significant intersection with the psychology of women, and I've been very influenced by that literature as well. Having voice, finding our voice, the internalization of sexism, and the ways that women internalize oppression, and is important for contemplative work as well, to see what we're believing about ourselves as women and to liberate ourselves from that through deep seeing and awareness of what's really going on in our minds. But I think there's several ways that understanding women and the psychology of women has you know, much resonance with a soulfulness approach.
Thank you so much. So a lot of questions are coming in all of a sudden, which is great, but I'm not sure we're going to have time to answer them all. So I'm just going to try to find something here to share with everyone. So one question, and we might have to ask for clarification, but one question was, can you speak a little more about how to enter a zone?
Yeah, I probably need a little more clarification on that, but you know, kind of what comes up for me is that's part of why I use music a lot. You know, sometimes people have difficulty just kind of going and sitting and like, okay, I'm going to meditate now. Okay, I'm gonna, you know, and we need a transition from, you know, an orientation to being out there to kind of, ooh, taking that deep drop into ourselves and our bodies and our experience. And music can transition people towards that zone, right? So I'm not exactly sure what the question is, but I think that's what came up. That's what came up for me. Creating safe spaces for people, giving people permission to be who they are, and for whatever comes up to come up in whatever kind of contemplative practice we're doing. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's sort of how I interpret it as well, and I hope that answered the question. Yes, she just clarified, yes, place of meditation. So I think that did respond to that well. So I think we're actually going to close out on that note. We are at an hour.
I'd just like to invite people. I have my contact information up here. Please feel free to reach out. I'd be glad to you know, interact with you around any questions about soulfulness. There's a lot of information in the slides, and I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to some of that, but you know, the practices I've experienced you know, have been very powerful in resonating with culturally diverse communities in Los Angeles so far, and so I'd be glad to kind of share my experiences with you. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, I think we would all love to spend another hour or several hours with you, Shelly. So I look forward to getting a chance to work with you again. So I just wanted to remind everyone that the webinar has been recorded and will be available on our website along with the PowerPoint slides. And that can be found on our website, contemplativemind.org, under the webinar archive. And I'd also like to just quickly share that there is still time to submit an application for the 2019 summer session on contemplative learning and higher education. To learn more, you can find information on our website. You may not be aware of this since we have such a wide reach, but in actuality, the Center for Contemplative Mind is just 3 full-time staff members. So all donations really do make a difference no matter what the size. Shelly, thank you again so much for being with us today, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Take care. Be well.